Why did Walter White poison Brock? It isn't a mystery why most protagonists are called the hero of their own respective stories. Their glaring flaws enable them to be depicted in a sympathetic light. No matter how flawed they might be, they never seem to fail to do the right thing. Harry Potter had a piece of evil within him, but he managed to defeat Lord Voldemort through the power of love and friendship. Iron Man was selfish and arrogant, but he managed to save the world through a noble act of self-sacrifice. These mundane, human flaws, coupled with acts of moral righteousness, are supposed to enable us to more easily relate and project ourselves onto them. That's why these characters are also called perspective characters. They are the viewpoint from which the audience are supposed to see and experience the rest of the show. These characters wouldn't work as well if they were to embody traditionally evil characteristics, because no one likes to see these features within themselves. Most people would be adverse to it. However, this is not to say that there haven't been any perspective characters that are less than heroic. Certain shows are trying to tell a different story. In Breaking Bad, a crime show about, well, crime, the show puts us in the perspective of character Walter White. On the surface, he seems to check all the boxes of what makes a good perspective character. He was flawed, a middle-aged high school teacher who was way overqualified for his job and was suffering from a recently discovered cancer. He felt like his family didn't respect him enough, and he was about to die leaving nothing behind. Walter White was also portrayed as having a sound moral motivation. Despite committing illegal activities, he did it all, at least on the surface, so that his family would be financially secure after his potential passing. However, Walter eventually transformed into something different entirely as he got more and more comfortable committing terrible acts of crime. Although for most of the show, Walter was still presented as the hero of the story, committing necessary evil for a noble cause. One act of crime that Walter did at the end of the penultimate season of the series entirely recontextualizes his role in the show. In this video, I'm going to elaborate on how Walt poisoning Brock becomes a setup for the show's final season, and how it expresses Walt's capabilities to manipulate anyone, whether they are friend or foe, and stop at nothing to further his own goals. Why did Walter poison an innocent child? The obvious and surface-level answer would be, he did it to turn Jesse against Gus so that he could be utilized in his plan to overthrow the Chicken Man. Up until this point in the show, Gus has been attempting to separate Walt from Jesse. The reason that Gus initially did not want to do business with Walt was largely due to the fact that Gus perceived him to be a poor judge of character. Having someone like Jesse as a partner did not bode well with Gus. Gus saw Jesse as a liability for Walt, someone who Walt would be better without. However, Gus understood that he couldn't just kill Jesse due to how strangely attached Walt was to his former student. Therefore, Gus was forced to utilize Jesse in creative ways. Instead of getting rid of him, he tried to train Jesse. He put Jesse in positions where he can prove himself useful and rewarded him appropriately for doing so. Walt, in turn, understood perfectly what Gus was doing. Walt also knew that Gus's plan was working. Jesse's view on Gus gradually softened. This concerned Walt because if Jesse wasn't unanimously hostile toward Gus, then Walt's position as Jesse's anchor and trusted confidant was no longer safe. Eventually, Walt would lose the single reason he was willing to put up with Jesse's apparent lack of competence: the fact he was loyal to Walt. And so, Walt poisoned Brock, hoping that Jesse would believe that Gus did it, and would eventually agree to help Walt overthrow him. How did Walt know that poisoning Brock would work in his favor? Walt effectively made use of Jesse's soft spot towards children. That, and the fact that Jesse knew Gus, or at least some of his men, had harmed children in the past. Walt knew that if Brock was poisoned, Gus would be the prime suspect instead of him. Furthermore, it was obvious to Walt that Jesse would feel that elevated urgency that Walt himself had felt in relation to their plan to kill Gustavo. Jesse would think that if left alone, the Chicken Man was eventually going to endanger all his loved ones. Successfully planting the idea in Jesse's head was key to solidifying his resolve to become Walt's accomplice in his plan to kill Gus. Walt's capacity for morally atrocious acts had gradually grown from the beginning of the series. From first murdering Crazy 8 and eventually taking the lives of Gus's men to protect Jesse, Walt was no longer a stranger to taking lives. While poisoning Brock was not necessarily an attempted murder, it was definitely portrayed and seen by both the show and the audience as crueler than a simple murder of another adult who was also in the game. Up until this point, we could always see Walt as a tragic figure trying to do the right thing. His first murder was in self-defense. His second one was done to protect his precious friend and partner. There was also a justification that could lead back into the solidified context of being the hero of the show. However, the act of poisoning Brock did not have such justifications. It was far removed from even an anti-hero perspective that most of us would have probably assigned to Walt at that point. Even letting Jane die, as another cruel thing Walt did in the show, could still be seen as a parental figure trying to provide tough love to his son. Leaving her dead as a cautionary tale for Jesse of what could happen to him were he to continue this downward spiral of heroin use. Poisoning Brock, therefore, not only marked Walt's complete transformation into Heisenberg, but it also reformulated the whole show. The 4 seasons of Breaking Bad leading up to the confirmation of Walt poisoning an innocent child had been, for the most part, straightforward in terms of its heroes and villains. We see Walt starting off as a small meth cook with his partner Jesse. Together, they tried to get into business with and took down several small-time antagonists like Tuco and Crazy 8, before moving on to bigger targets like the Salamancas, and eventually Gus. After Gus died, the show immediately lacked an antagonist. With the direction the show was going, we couldn't help but wonder what was going to be next as part of Walt's drug business expansion. What kind of other drug lord or threatening force would Walt have to deal with? However, because Walt poisoned Brock, we need only to look to Walt himself to figure out who was going to fill the role of the villain in the show's last season. This shifted Walt from his anti-hero status into what's called a villain protagonist. Unlike a villain or an anti-hero, the villain protagonist is still a perspective character, but they were no longer necessarily meant as someone you are supposed to root for. This is what is embodied in the last season. The show had spent the last 4 seasons setting up Walt to be the final season's villain. We could see that while the story is still centered around Walt, it becomes more about his inevitable downfall and how whether the people around him could stop the atrocities he was continuing to commit. It also starts portraying Walt as more and more villainous, having him planning premeditated murders of people he didn't know personally, as well as resorting to working with actual neo-Nazis. From the standpoint of the show, this was the core reason Walt had to poison Brock. Brock's poisoning showcases the crux of Walter White's downward spiral. It is the natural extension of Walt's character arc, having him slowly grow the capacity for destruction, with each act more sinister than the last. It also effectively shows how competent Walt was as a manipulator. He thoroughly understood Jesse and how his mind operated, ruthlessly using the best parts of himself in order to put Jesse in a position of absolute loyalty to him, while also doing the one thing Jesse despised the most. Brock's poisoning was also used as a sharp turning point of the series. It set up to Walt's last stage of transformation and his eventual shift into a complete villain. This singular act did as much for Walt that it did for the show. It showed us very blatantly and clearly how far he had come from the unintrusive high school teacher that just wanted what was best for his family he thought he loved more than himself.